Good afternoon, everybody. I am Jamie Green with Plug-in KC. So excited to have everybody here today. We're going to talk all about workplace charging, why you should do it. This is brought to you also by our friends at WSP and our friends at Evergy. So we're just going to get started with some introductions. Again, I'm with Greenhouse Consulting. I am a consultant for Plug-in KC. I've been working on sustainability and energy issues since 2007. Before that, I was at the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Phil Jennings.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm Phil Jennings. I lead our clean vehicle planning team here in WSP's Kansas City office. We're the largest engineering company that you've never heard of. We have over 40,000 worldwide employees and a small but dedicated team of around 100 professionals here in Kansas City. Thank you, Plug-in KC and Evergy, for the opportunity to join you all today. I'll pass it over to Wendy.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Wendy Marine. I'm a lead product manager here on our electrification team at Evergy. I manage our Clean Charge Network, which is the utility-owned and operated EV charging infrastructure throughout our service territory. And I also have responsibility for our incentives that we offer to both our residential and commercial customers for installing EV charging infrastructure. And at this time, I think I'll turn it back to Phil. Thank you, everybody.
All right, everybody. So I think the one thing that we always want to talk about, why are we here today? Why is this important? So why should you consider workplace charging? The first thing is an MIT study that just came out this week has shown that if you put workplace charging, you actually will help nearby businesses to the tune of about $1,500 because people will park their car to charge it and then have time to kill. And with time to kill, they like to go inside and shop. So that's one thing. For your employees, it actually reduces range anxiety for employees. Also for your clients and your visitors, folks know that there's a charging station there. They don't have to worry that there'll be enough charge to get back home. That's a good thing too. Also, it helps with EV adoption. If people see there's charging there at their workplace and other people are utilizing charging, they think, hey, I should maybe do this too. It's an amenity. Think of it as an amenity, like all the other programs that you offer for your employees and visitors. And it helps to attract and retain employees, which are all great things. One housekeeping thing, we will take all of your questions, put those in the chat box, and at the end of the formal presentation, we will answer questions. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to Phil, and he's going to talk all about the ins and outs about workplace charging and why you should do it. So Phil, floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Let's get started. I'm going to start by giving you all a quick primer on the different kinds of chargers if you've never driven an electric vehicle. Keyword here is quick. This is a riveting topic, I can assure you, but I won't spend too much time on it. So you really need to think of the different charging standards as having three different speeds, if you will, and a few different shapes of plugs, analogous to kind of your Android versus iPhone plug shape on the phone world. So let's start with level one. So if you've ever stood awkwardly at an airport trying to slowly charge your phone on one of those free chargers that's like under the seat before your flight, that's a level one charger. Um, they're painfully slow, almost to a point where it's just infuriatingly slow. They still use about 1,000 watts of power, which is similar to a hair dryer or microwave oven in your home. They plug into a regular outlet and they're typically portable. They used to come with the cars. A lot of times now that since not everyone is using them, they may not actually include them, but they're only a couple $100 if you need to buy one. Level two chargers, they can be portable, but typically are permanently installed either at a home or business. These are the ones that they're going to have you topped up overnight. They use about the same amount of power as an oven or a clothes dryer in your home, about 10,000 watts. So typically 8 to 10 times quicker charge than that level one I just mentioned. And then you've got your level three or your DC fast charging stations. So this is really what's equivalent to a gas station. These are really insane levels of power. That first level one charger uses about 1,000 watts. Like I said, about a hair dryer. These level three chargers use anywhere from 50,000 to 350,000 watts of power. So much, 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 much faster than those portable chargers. Some vehicles can add a significant amount of range in as little as 10 minutes. Not only do the chargers themselves cost more, typically upwards of $100,000 compared to about $200 for those level ones, but because of that and because of how quick they are and how much power they use, the cost of the electricity is actually significantly higher as well, typically about 5 to 10 times more expensive, and tends to be about the same price per mile as filling up your car with gas. However, they are extremely convenient. This is what you'd be relying on if you go on a road trip or you're on a highway out significantly far away from your home or workplace charging. That's all I'm going to say about level 3 today. We're mostly going to focus on that level 2. That's usually that sweet spot between cost effectiveness and the speed of charge, and usually what you're going to see at businesses. So why does this matter? Like Jamie mentioned, workplace charging can be a significant benefit to employees. We did a real, actual scientific survey earlier this year, which indicated that at least half of drivers in Kansas City would consider buying an electric vehicle in the next 10 years or so. It's not everybody, but frankly, it's a lot more people than I expected. So if we go to the next slide, we also built an economic forecasting model to figure out exactly how many people would be buying EVs each year between now and 2035, and then where in Kansas City they live. If your organization employs a lot of young professionals, the percentage that drivers at your organization will probably even be higher than this. Right now, we're at about 10,000 vehicles throughout the entire Kansas City metro. That's expected to go up by a factor of 10 to about 100,000 cars by 2035. A big reason for this is that the vast majority of these vehicles are going to be bought used. And most of them are going to be under $30,000. Having an EV is not the flex that it was 10 years ago when your neighbors bought a Tesla and wanted to show it off, but they're still just as fun to drive. Adding workplace charging is a relatively inexpensive way to add a meaningful benefit for your employees and visitors at your organization, and maybe even add a reason for employees to come back to the office. Free coffee, free bagels, and maybe cheap EV charging. Drivers will buy an EV if they have access to charging at home or work. And this is a big reason why federal incentives for EV charging are aimed at employers and businesses. If you have visitors that stay a while, think of places like hospitals, schools, universities. It may make sense to target them as well. Although it may not make sense at places for visitors if they don't stay very long, places like grocery stores and retail centers. Those level 2 chargers that I mentioned, you can get a little bit, but you're only adding probably 3, 4, 5% of charge, in the 30 minutes or so that you run into a grocery store. But you can pretty much fully recharge your vehicle throughout a full 8-hour workday. Next slide. So what does a project like this look like, and what does it take to make it successful? So I'm going to touch on the project conceptual phase, the design phase, a little bit on construction, and then some things to keep in mind as you get into that operations and maintenance phase after these chargers are actually installed. What do you need to think about? First thing to keep in mind is, let's stay on that last slide. Not every driver needs to charge at work. Home charging is common for those that own their own homes, but it's much more difficult for renters and those that live in apartments and condos. Do you know where your employees live? What about your visitors? Like I mentioned before, if you have a large number of young professionals at your organization, they may not yet own their own homes or may not ever plan to own their own home. In which case, it's going to be much harder for them to find a place to charge if they don't have access to workplace charging. These are relatively low cost, simple projects, at least compared to your normal commercial construction project. Small things can be the difference between a useful, successful project and one that sits underutilized at the back of the parking lot and does not meet your organizational objectives. The simplicity and low cost can also lead to important things being overlooked. Hot new industry like this leads to there being a lot of new vendors, new contractors that may not have extensive track records in the type of projects like this, leaving some of their customers disappointed. Also, standalone small projects may not necessarily have the budget to engage a specialized design team or general contractor, which may make certain things get overlooked as well. Next slide. So let's build the business case for EV charging at work. Let's start with who will use these chargers. Are these going to be employees, visitors, maybe even some of your own company vehicles? Let's look at what the impacts are on where we can locate these chargers. So how long do visitors usually stay? Like I mentioned, when you're looking at providing it for employees, do you intend this to be a free benefit or do you intend to bill them for the electricity? This is a common question that I get because I really think a lot of people are assuming that the cost of electricity from some of these chargers is similar to like giving your employees the full tank of gas, which is what, 50, 60 bucks now for a lot of vehicles, maybe more if you have a larger vehicle. But really, with the cost of electricity, most of the time, and Wendy can probably provide some examples here in a little bit that Evergy's seen. Um, these costs are much, much less than that. I think I calculated that on my mid-size electric vehicle, a full tank of gas, if you will, in the battery costs under $6 if I charge it at home, which would be similar to what it would cost to charge at a business. So we're not talking insane amounts of money here. We're talking probably, if they're used all day and you put 4 of these in, you may be paying $50 or $60 a day in electricity, and that's on the high end. Will I make money? So probably the next quick follow-up question I get on whether or not you can bill your employees for it is, well, can I use this as a revenue generation system at my business? Can I actually make money selling power? And that the answer to that is a little more complicated. Yes, you certainly can. However, that's probably shouldn't be the driving force for building your business case. A lot of things have to happen for that to be true, and that's really because of that front end costs to put in the infrastructure. It's like building a building, right? You don't depreciate a building over 5 years. You tend to use it for a very long time, and so in order for that to really become a big source of revenue generation, you really have to look over that longer time frame. Probably 20 years or more. But you can certainly cover a lot of, if not all of the operating costs by billing users for the electricity that they use. Another part of that business case is, does your company or organization have any sustainability goals? Electric vehicle stations are great for meeting sustainability goals, and they actually can help achieve LEED certification in buildings. So if you haven't reached out to somebody in your organization that maybe is in charge of that sort of thing, it'd be a great thing to have a conversation about. How many chargers do we need? Depends on the use case above, but typically we see company or business installation somewhere in that 4 to 10, maybe 16 level 2 chargers range for that initial build out, unless you have a guaranteed need for more than that. So then how are you going to pay for the ongoing costs? So yeah, there's costs with putting these things in up front. Of course, Wendy will touch on the costs on the utility side and bringing in power to them. Of course, you need to potentially do some parking lot modifications. But a lot of times people overlook some of those ongoing costs and things you need to think about as well. So, for instance, if you're going to bill customers or employees for the electricity, you're going to need an internet connection, a cloud connection. You're going to have a contract with a payment processor. Somebody needs to take Apple Pay or Google Pay when they roll up to there and tap their phone on it. Of course, the cost of electricity as well. And then will this be a standalone project or part of a larger construction effort? It certainly can bring the overall cost down of a project like this if you can wrap it into some other planned upgrades to a building. If you know you're already going to be resurfacing a parking lot, for example, great opportunity to put some electric vehicle chargers in. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So once you get to that design phase, what are some of the things we need to think of? So absolute number one, have you talked to the electric utility? In Kansas City, that may be Evergy, but it may not be Evergy. It could be BPU, Independence Power and Light, Gardner Electric if you're out in Gardner. We do have a number of other utilities as well. So make sure you know who that person is at the utility that handles electric vehicle projects. They may have specific requirements to be eligible for rebates if they're offering rebates on equipment. An example with Evergy is that they do require you to have a cloud connection so that they can monitor the electricity use coming from the charger in order to be eligible for that rebate. So there's certain vendors that are eligible, certain vendors are not. They can also help provide insight into the best locations on your site to help minimize some of those infrastructure costs. The engineer like me might think it's an absolute great idea to put it in one spot, or like actually, the engineer would never make that mistake. The architect might think it's a great idea to put it in one spot, and then the utility may inform us that you're going to need 400 or 500 feet of trenching in order to get power to it. So you need to balance those considerations when picking a location on your site. And then also ask about that impact to the schedule. Ever since COVID started in early 2020, there's been long lead times on a lot of electrical equipment. So there's a number of projects around town that are pretty much done, but waiting on one specific part that could take 6 months or longer to arrive at the site, and so the entire project can't be completed. So it's important to understand that up front because that could impact funding, can certainly impact when you qualify for certain um, you know tax benefits or rebate programs. This is also the time when you want to think about accessibility and user experience. For instance, my background is as an electrical engineer, and I still get nervous plugging my car in to a car charger in the rain. I don't know about you, but it's just a lot of power to be handling when you're getting drenched. So maybe having the spot be covered is a great idea. Um, ADA requirements. Is this an accessible spot, or did you just put these in the far back corner of the parking lot because it's the cheapest place to put it? That may not fly. Not only because it's considering making it accessible is the right thing to do, but it may also be legally required. Do you need an app for that? Make sure you understand how the payment method works on the particular type of charger that you get. Some of them are absolutely infuriating to roll up and realize that you can't just tap your phone or a credit card in order to get them started, and you end up spending 5 to 10 minutes downloading some special app and signing up for an account just so you can get $4 or $5 worth of electricity. So, um, if at all possible, try to use the equipment that you buy before you actually spend time ordering it and installing it on your site. This is a great reason to include an architect on the design team. If you have one that you already work with at your business, great time to get them queued in. They help you think of things like lighting. Building codes require higher light levels at chargers than in a normal parking lot. This so you can see what you're doing, so you can plug and unplug and know what you're doing in the dark. And parking lots really only require a very minimal amount of light if they're not being used for anything else. So this is something you may need to include as well. And then finally, are you thinking about the future? Um, Being an engineer by trade, I tend to be excessively cheap, which means I always end up with buyer's remorse. Inevitably, every time I get a new phone, I end up buying the base model, thinking that there's no reason to pay $300-400 more, for the next model up. But then inevitably, I always wish I had it. I run out of room taking pictures of my kids. I don't have room to store any additional pictures. I realize I don't have the fancy zoom lens, so I can't zoom in on my kid when he's playing soccer. Turns out probably would have been money well spent. And the same is true for projects like this. It's a heck of a lot cheaper to dig once. Um, Conduit is cheap, digging up parking lots is not. And so it's a lot easier to dig and put in extra conduit into the ground so you can run future wires 5 to 10 years from now if your requirements change than it is to come and redo this project and start from the beginning. So finally, at this stage, it's a great idea to involve the accountants and find out if your funding sources have any special requirements. For instance, certain federal grants may have Buy America requirements that impact where equipment is manufactured. Vendor selection, of course, for Evergy's rebate, like I mentioned earlier. And also, does your in-service date impact these funding requirements? For example, if your company is planning on using a particular tax credit, those tax credits are typically based on when that equipment is placed into service. So when that project is done and when it is useful, not when you buy it. Let's go to the next slide. Construction. So construction is usually the easy part of a project like this. They're similar to a normal parking lot lighting upgrade if you've put streetlights in, or a repaving project at a business. But there are some things you want to keep in mind that may be specific to EV charging projects. So again, make sure your schedule aligns with the utility schedule and your schedule. Utility equipment lead times may drive that in-service date if there is a back order on a particular piece of equipment. Funding availability, like I mentioned, and then how will the construction impact operations and parking availability? Again, this is something that can be overlooked if this is a standalone project because maybe you're not involving as many people as you would in a larger construction project in your organization. So they may not necessarily all know that it's going on. For instance, if you're adding a significant number of chargers, you could require trenching and plating of your parking lot. So maybe don't schedule it during your company's annual tailgate. Can this project be incorporated into another project to lower costs? If you're planning renovation in the next couple of years, much more cost effective to tag these EV chargers onto that project scope. And then finally, the operations and maintenance. Think through from the beginning. We can go next slide. So think through from the beginning, who's responsible for addressing user concerns and problems? Somebody pulls up, charge won't start, customer was billed the wrong amount. They pull up and plug their car in and there's just a little red flashing light and they don't know what to do. You need to have some idea of who's going to be responsible for that. Good news is there are third parties that will handle all of this. You do not necessarily have to do it internally, but you do need to have a plan for whose job is it, and who are you going to contract with to make sure that it doesn't become your job. How do I plan to handle those ongoing testing and maintenance? There's not a ton to do here, but just like anything, bugs get inside electrical equipment. You need to clean out the cobwebs. Electrical connections need to be checked and cleaned once a year or so. Those payment terminals need to be tested to make sure that when you try to swipe your credit card, it still works. The software's up to date, et cetera. So again, there are third parties that will handle all of this, but you want to go in up front understanding what that's going to look like. And then, of course, make sure your signage hasn't been vandalized. Striping on your parking lots continues to be maintained properly, et cetera. This is also when you probably want to bring accounting and IT into that commissioning process. Smart chargers require an internet connection. Somebody probably needs to make sure that that can connect to that internet at your site. Somehow integrate it with your back end of your enterprise or cloud connection so that you can get billing integrated with your accounting workflows at your organization. Whether that's incoming billing or outgoing billing, either way, you're going to be paying for electricity, and you may also have funds coming in if you're charging customers or employees for the electricity as well. And then finally, something that a lot of people probably don't think about, but being a kindergarten soccer coach, I've realized that mediating disputes is something that you really need to think about. So, do you have procedures for mediating driver disputes, such as towing unauthorized vehicles? Somebody will 100% guaranteed park a large diesel Dodge Ram in the EV spot and leave it all day. What are you going to do? Are you going to tow them? What if they're a customer or a client? Are you still going to tow them? So think these things through, have processes and procedures in place up front so that when it happens, you know how you're going to respond. Some cities in Kansas City have recently passed ordinances related to parking in EV spots, and it may now actually be illegal to park in them if you're not charging your vehicle. So check your local laws. Do you have a plan for when the charger reaches its end of life? So, and Wendy can maybe speak to this too, because Evergy has had one of the largest networks of level 2 chargers in the entire United States and has been in service for over 10 years. But we've typically seen charger lifespan tends to be 5 to 10 years or so. And that's just for the charger itself. All of the electrical equipment itself, the switch gear, the electrical panels, the wires, that lifespan tends to be 20, 30, 40 years or more. But that charger lifespan, it's getting plugged and unplugged an awful lot. It just doesn't quite last as long. Also, anything connected to the internet just doesn't seem to last more than 5 years or so. Good example is some of Evergy's chargers had to be taken out of service because when they were originally put in, they relied on the 3G internet connection with the old cell phone standard. And then all the phone companies shut off those towers and the chargers no longer had a connection to the internet, even though they continue to work just fine from a charging perspective. So just something to keep in mind. And then finally, make sure you have a plan for addressing security and vandalism. Locating in the back corner may be less expensive, but also likely to be a target, more likely to be a target of theft. Make sure that you're within view of your company's security cameras, and consider safety of drivers at all times of day and weather conditions as well. We want drivers that are using these to feel safe when they're using them. Okay, next slide. I do have one example on cost. You're welcome. I'm giving you actual cost numbers here, but please take it with a grain of salt. All projects are different. So this is really sort of your best case scenario, I guess, for a retrofit of an existing office building. So this was an example I did in early 2023 with 8 level 2 chargers installed sort of at the back of the parking lot. It wasn't a huge parking lot, so we didn't have to do any trenching of the asphalt of the parking lot itself. Well, we could put them behind, and it was relatively close by to Evergy's system as well. So you can see really what drove the cost here was the cost of the chargers. They tend to be $2,000 to $3,000 each for a commercial grade charger. You do have some underground electrical and above ground electrical work that needed to be done as well. Ended up coming before any subsidies or anything to about $55,000. Again, this was in 2023, so we all know inflation has been a thing. So take with that what you will. But I do want to mention that there are some federal and other incentives as well that can get that cost down. So we came up to about $7,000 per port before any incentives. Depending on where your business is located and what your tax situation looks like, you can get a potentially get a federal tax credit up to 30%, which can bring it down. And then Evergy, in this case, had a $20,000 rebate as well, bringing that adjusted cost per port to a little over $2,000. So I'm going to appreciate the time. I'm going to turn it over to Wendy, and she's going to talk about a little bit of how Evergy can get involved.
Great. Thank you, Phil. Phil provided us with a lot of insightful information, and hopefully you don't feel too overwhelmed. I mean, there is a lot to consider as you're thinking about putting in EV charging stations. But as a whole, I like to kind of maybe compartmentalize those cost buckets. And I think of it from a utility perspective. Will I have some additional costs incurred for bringing in new service to support the bank of EV chargers? What is it going to cost me from an electrician's perspective, from the utility meter to the charging station, to bring in the conduit and the wiring to support the charging stations and install the chargers? And then lastly, the bucket for the actual physical charging station itself. I'm going to touch on the aspects of the utility piece and the customer side of the meter here over the next few minutes. Again, just want to reiterate, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat so that we can address those at the end. I always want to reiterate that it's great to bring your utility in very early on in the project. I think Phil touched on this, and I'm just going to express how important that is. One, I believe your utility will be in a position to collaborate with you. And if the earlier you bring us in on that project, the better it would be for everyone concerned. We can bring some valuable solutions to you that maybe you didn't think about. Siting of where those charging stations are going to go could save you significant money if it's closer to the utility infrastructure versus the premium spots at the front of your building. So bringing us in early to help with siting of those locations, offering you other considerations for lower cost locations, also helping prevent potential roadblocks that might arise if you had not thought about it before the construction stage. Effective communication is paramount. So just ensuring, meetings, conference calls, maybe pretty regularly to ensure that all the project lead times are falling in place as you had expected. And then project timelines is crucial for the project success as well. Phil referenced some potential backlog and long lead times for Evergy equipment. That could be true based on the size of your project if the capacity at your location is not great enough to support the number of charging stations you're thinking about installing. So just want to take a moment there just to express how important it is to bring a utility on board early and how much we appreciate collaborating with you in that opportunity of planning out your project. Next slide, please, Phil. Thank you. So Phil also alluded to this. Evergy does have some incentives to help offset that cost of putting in EV charging stations at your workplace. I would recommend you check with your utility if Evergy is not the one that currently services your business. But presently, we are offering an incentive for 10 level 2 ports at a workplace at $2,500 per port. So that's a maximum per site of $25,000. This is a 5-year program, and we're nearing the end of the 3rd year in Kansas and nearing the end of the 2nd year in Missouri. We still have funds available. So, if you're thinking about a project, we'd love to talk to you about it in greater detail and get you through the pre-approval process to ensure that we've locked down some funds for you and your workplace charging initiative. So this is, in order to be eligible for the incentive, you must agree to purchase networked charging equipment, and that's having the software cloud associated with the hardware that does the talking with, through the Wi-Fi, allows you to monitor the health of the charging station. It allows you to set rates if you wanted to charge rates to visitors at your establishment or after-hour visitors. And keep rates free for your employees. There's ways to set different pricing mechanisms based on the type of person that might use your charging station. You also do not have to make workplace chargers public in order to be eligible for the incentive. So these could be private stations just for the use of your employees and visitors during business hours, still eligible for the incentive. You do have to purchase from a qualified equipment list that Evergy has pre-vetted. That is online at evergy.com. Ways to save will get you to the EV rebate informational pages and more details in regards to equipment vendors, as well as the full terms and conditions for eligibility. If you're a Missouri business, there is an additional step for eligibility of the incentive, and that is it is required that your bank of charging stations be separately metered. So that will always guarantee that you could potentially have an additional cost from Evergy to bring that new service. But for both Kansas and Missouri, that utility component, that cost to serve, is discounted based on that new load that you're bringing to the utility. So again, another reason to speak to the utility early to assess what that additional cost would be. Could potentially be at no cost to you, depending on the load of the charging infrastructure that you're bringing on board. Secondly, we also offer discounted rates for the banks of EV charging stations. This is called our business EV charging service. It is a time of use rate for EV charging stations that has a traditional 3-period rate of a peak, off-peak, and super off-peak. For commercial businesses, the peak hours are 2 to 8 p.m. This is very complementary, however, to workplace charging, as employees typically get to work 6, 7 a.m. in the morning. They start charging, they get off after 2-3 hours. An additional vehicle can get on. You can typically get 2 to 3 vehicles on a port ahead of those peak hours where the most costly energy is being served. This business EV charging rate also offers a discounted demand charge than the traditional commercial and industrial rates that your building is being charged today. So I highly recommend you consider that for your workplace charging. In order to have that rate, you do have to separately meter the bank of EV chargers. If you decide that you're going to put in just one charging station and tie it into your building load panel that exists today, you will not qualify for that rate as it's designed currently. There could potentially also be some tax credits available to you. So I urge you to take a look at the IRS alternative fuel vehicle pages. If you're in a eligible census tract, you could be eligible for up to 30% of the cost of your projects, up to $100,000. This could be pretty significant for you if you're considering putting in a large bank of charging stations. That $100,000 is on a per charging station basis too, I should add. And then if you live in Kansas, you could potentially be available for some additional Kansas alternative fuel tax credits. So please be sure you check the IRS pages and the Kansas Department of Revenue for those tax credits and to determine whether or not you would be eligible. Next slide, please. So I thought I would just share a quick workplace use case with you. I'm using my own building that I work in here at 1KC at 1200 Main Street. We did put in our first EV chargers for the employees back in 2015. At that time, we determined, based on the number of individuals we knew were probably currently driving EVs and what our strategic plans were for promoting EV adoption, to put in 3 charging stations, which were 6 ports. The building that we reside in has typically about 600 employees here on any given day. So with those 6 ports, we started out for the first couple of years saw great utilization. And as EV adoption grew, we knew we needed to expand the charging infrastructure here at the building. We had the foresight in 2015 to put in the initial infrastructure to support multiple charging stations. So in 2017, when we added 2 more charging stations, an additional 4 ports, we didn't have to incur any additional costs for the wiring and conduit. We just had to purchase some additional charging stations and have those installed to the infrastructure that was already in place to support those charging stations. So today, as we sit here today, we have 10 charging ports here in this building supporting about 600 employees. And we have an estimated number of EVs that we're supporting now of about 30 that we are pretty regularly comfortable seeing at the charging stations. And you're probably saying, how do you charge 30 vehicles with 10 ports? There are some management tools that we've deployed that have helped with the usage of this charging station so that we don't have to add any additional yet at this point in time. We have put signage up that has asked employees to be considerate and to only charge for 2 hours at a time. A 2-hour session at a 7.2 kW charging station can give an EV driver about 50 miles of range. That should be plenty of mileage for a typical local commuter coming to work and just driving back home. So with that 2-hour limit, each EV driver is getting about 50 miles of range. We also have just recently enabled a wait list. So now if I arrive to work at 8:30 and I see all the charging stations are already used, I can put my name via an app on a wait list. When Phil, for instance, is done charging his vehicle, he will be nudged to unplug the charger and move his vehicle because there's somebody waiting to use the charger. So now I'll get a notification that Phil has moved his car. I don't know it's Phil though, but I'll get a notification he moved his car from stall A, and I will now go get my car and move to stall A and begin my charging session. It won't let Jamie begin a charging session there because that stall is already waiting for me to bring my vehicle there. If I don't respond to that waitlist notification within 30 minutes, it does remove me from the line and I have to go back to the end of the line per se. But it has really helped us manage use of the 10 charging ports we have here today. I would say our utilization during business days is quite high. We do see a very cyclical chain reaction of EV drivers coming in, charging, leaving, and another vehicle utilizing that spot on a given business day. I did head out there to the parking garage just before this meeting just to see how many cars were charging, and 8 of the 10 parking stalls were in use and actively charging vehicles. I also just wanted to drop in a graph here that I've pulled down from our monitoring system just to demonstrate what the typical workplace load shape looks like. And as you can see from all this gobbledygook in here, the peak is somewhere around 11 a.m., 12 p.m., based on the number of cars at the charging stations, and then starts to taper off after lunchtime. This just demonstrates in a visual manner that this is very complementary to that 3-tier price of the business EV charging service rate, enabling you to take advantage of both that off-peak and super off-peak pricing for your employees at your workplace. Next slide. And lastly, I wanted to provide you with some additional resources. It is very advantageous for you to engage an electrician early on, an electrician that is licensed and is very knowledgeable about installing EV charging stations. If you're a large enough entity that you have the benefit of having a consultant that's very knowledgeable about the EV charging space, highly recommend them as well. But if you're just getting started or you're just curious and have more questions, I've dropped here a couple of resources online. The Department of Energy has some valuable information there regarding workplace charging in form of a workshop toolkit. Empower at the bottom has some resources as well that you can use for free to become more knowledgeable and share information about workplace charging. And that one there in the middle, that is a site that was developed by CalSTART called chargeatwork.org. I find them to be a very valuable resource, and you may as well. They offer a free site assessment. So you can go online, enter your information, and within a few business days, somebody should contact you, talk to you about your project at your workplace, completely free. I'm not sure if they actually come to your workplace, but definitely a free site assessment sounds very attractive. They also have a project builder online that allows you to plan your charging site, and it does provide you with some estimated cost, both in the cost for installing the charging infrastructure as well as potential O&M costs. They also have free employee engagement support. So if you're curious how many employees at your place of business are interested in having workplace EV charger, or how many are thinking about getting an electric vehicle, it offers you some tools on how to survey your employees and other affinity groups that may provide valuable information to you as you start thinking about your charging project there at your workplace. Thank you. Next slide.
Thanks very much, Wendy. That's a lot of good information in a short amount of time. So this is your opportunity while we've got the experts here. If you have questions, put them in the chat. We will read them to you. While we're waiting for our first question, this is the first of our 2 events for Drive Electric Week. This webinar next Saturday. So in 9 days, we will be out at Olathe 4 doing an EV tailgate. And that information is on our Facebook page and also on our LinkedIn page, but it's a free event. Come out and test drive a car and check it out. See what you think. All right. First question from Sherry. Who will manage the stations? Are there any grants or funds to help maintain EV stations? That sounds like mostly a Phil, but a little bit of Wendy as well. There's Phil.
I'm back. Yeah, I can take that one. Federal grants specifically are mainly aimed at the upfront cost of installing the stations. There may be some local support that can help with some of the ongoing costs, but typically the ongoing cost is not a part of the incentives. Although I do want to keep in mind that the ongoing costs really are not necessarily significant. If they're being heavily used, and certainly if you're not giving the power away for free, you may be able to cover a lot of that just from user fees. Certainly compared to the construction costs, those ongoing costs are much, much less.
Great. All right. How long does it take to charge a level 2 station? A car, I assume, instead of a care.
I'll jump in on that one. So it really depends on the state of the vehicle when it pulls into a level 2 charging station. As I said before, at a 7.2 kW charging station, which is very typical for the Kansas City area, an EV driver can get about 25 minutes of range in 1 hour of charging at a level 2 charging station.
All right, Sherry, with the third question. Thanks, Sherry. I appreciate how involved you are. Thank you for taking time. If gas is $3 a gallon, how much is the charging breakdown? So I guess
Sure,
just wanting the cost equivalent.
Yeah, I can take that one. And Wendy, I know Evergy has some good examples too, because you guys did a study earlier this year. But I calculated on my own vehicle, which is sort of a mid-size, small crossover SUV, and I calculated that it comes down to, from a mile per mile, equivalency. If I'm charging at home overnight, it comes out to roughly, I think, 25 cents a gallon for gas. Now, if I were to charge at a public level 2, and you're actually trying to make some money on that, or you're covering your costs, you'd probably be quite a bit more than that. Probably double or triple that at least. I know with Evergy's, it's still significantly less than the cost of gas, but I think it came out to about $1 a gallon. Because I think yours were around 25 cents per kilowatt hour at those public stations.
That's correct.
Still much less expensive than gas. But at that point, they have to recover the cost of that installation as well. So that really, really cheap number that I quoted for at home, that's ignoring the fact that I had to pay an electrician a couple $1,000s to install the thing. Once it's installed, it's extremely cheap to use. But you need to recoup some of those upfront costs as well and price that in, which makes it a little more expensive.
Anything to add on that, Wendy?
No, I was just thinking about it from a little bit of a different angle, right? If you're an employer who's thinking about putting in charging stations for your employees, you could set the pricing to be free for the employee who would use that charging station. In that case, charging for them will be $0. But on the flip side, you're still going to have that bill come from your utility that you're going to have to recover those costs. And just something to think about as you're trying to determine what the cost could potentially be for users of the level 2 charging stations. But Phil is correct. We are still well below a cost per gallon for gasoline.
All right, great. So Bill asked, does Evergy provide any technical support for the installation of quote unquote dumb non-network workplace chargers?
We do not. I mean, we can provide you our expertise just as from our experience of installing charging stations, but dumb chargers, I mean, there's really nothing to know about them. If they're broken, they're broken. You're not going to get any monitoring or communication to you that you're broken, other than somebody's going to call you and say, hey, the charging station is no longer working. It would be very challenging for a service provider to also service and maintain that charging station. At that point, you might have to cut your losses and just look at installing another inexpensive dumb charger.
I'll tag onto that a little bit, and just to say, playing devil's advocate here a little bit, that sometimes dumb chargers are the right way to go at a business, right? If it's relatively simple, you trust your employees, you're not trying to make money off of them. They can be significantly cheaper, and certainly a lot of that ongoing monthly expense has to do with that internet connection and that payment processor. So if you cut those out and you only have a couple of them, you could have very little ongoing expense, if any. A lot of what we've been seeing, or at least the perception that people are getting free power is a big reason that a lot of people want to bill for it. It's not necessarily because of that cost of electricity. It's just that a lot of times there's always that one person at work that's just upset that they don't have an EV and they don't get free gas. So why are you giving free electricity to some other employees? Not realizing that it's only about $3 worth of free electricity every month, and you probably give them way more coffee than that in the break room. So just keep that in mind too. That human behavior side of it could drive some of that. So having the ability to add a little bit more control may be worth it, even if you don't actually end up coming out ahead financially.
I'm going to add to that real quick, Phil. That's a very valid point, right? There are many use cases in which the dumb charger does make sense. Workplace could be one of those, especially a fleet application. If you're on the call and you also support fleet electrification at your company, just because Evergy or any utility is providing you free money does not mean you should spend more money to put in charging stations if it does not make sense for you financially to do so with a smart network charging station. That's all I wanted to add.
So Bill's follow-up, and this is totally you, Wendy, because you were the one that was talking about this. What's the software that you guys are using at Evergy for the encouraging sharing of the charging station? Sure.
So our entire network of the Clean Charge Network, we have ChargePoint hardware and software. I would say the software that I have evaluated on a number of network service providers, very similar functionality. Most of them provide the ability to set multiple pricing plans, create specific user groups, monitor the health of the charging stations, do remote resets, create wait lists, do power management where you can load shift or reduce the power of the load at specific times of the day. Or if you have capacity limitations, you could also set your bank of chargers to share a level. Like if it's a 7.2 kW charger, you would, for 2 ports, you usually need to have a 2-pole 40 amp circuit. But if you only have enough room for one, you can then split that circuit between 2 cars, and each car would get 3.6 kWh per hour. So I would say, although I'm using ChargePoint, most software providers have very similar and complementary services.
Great. So this next question is from Jesse, and I guess we have a couple more questions before we wrap up. Again, thanks everybody for joining us. Are there local zoning requirements that must be considered? What will the city of Kansas City, Missouri want to know about a business installing EV chargers? So it's probably both of you. I don't know who wants to grab that one.
I'm going to let Phil start that one.
Sure. I'll do my best with City of Kansas City, Missouri specifics. I probably can't answer it that specifically, but I have never heard of specific zoning issues if you're simply adding level 2 chargers to an existing structure. Now, that's not to speak to like the DC fast chargers where there would potentially be zoning issues if you're building a business specifically to sell electrical power and you're, kind of like a gas station. I would definitely expect that to have zoning issues. Now, there could certainly be permitting issues though. And that's why, again, considering some of those things up front, different cities are going to handle that differently. There's accessibility requirements. Some cities are enforcing that. Some are not. You'll notice a lot of the existing chargers are not accessible. They probably should have been when they were installed 10 years ago, but it's just not something that had been thought of or really integrated into that building code until recently to make sure that any amenities that are provided follow the Americans with Disabilities Act. Same with lighting. Lighting may be in building codes. That does not mean that every city is enforcing it equally. Again, because just a lot of city officials are still catching up on a lot of this stuff. So really, it's probably unlikely that if you were to pull a permit for an EV charging station and you don't change your lighting, no one's probably going to say anything. It's a really good idea to do. At some point, it's probably going to catch up, and local permitting officials and inspectors are going to say, "Oh, wait a second, the building code really applies to this the same way it applies to a gas pump, and you need to make sure you can see." So it's a really good idea to do it, but every city differs a little bit in what they're looking for.
The only thing I would add to that, Phil, this isn't zoning per se, but depending on where you're going to put your charging stations, the utility might have to get an easement for that infrastructure work potentially. So that's also something to consider when you're siting your location.
Great. Donna wants to know if there's any plans in the future to increase the charging power of level 2 chargers.
I can take that one. It's sort of settled. So we've been quoting that 10,000 watt, 10 kilowatt number as sort of that average. It's really a range of charge power levels. And at the moment, it tops out at roughly a little under 20 kilowatts, so 80 amps. And that really is driven by the vehicles themselves. And that's what really separates level 2 from that DC fast charger, is that level 2, all the brains of the charger, if you will, are inside the car, just like the brains of your phone charger are actually inside your phone. And the thing you plug into is just a dumb little brick that's changing the voltage level and giving the phone what it wants. So that's the same with level 2. And so the vehicle manufacturers really had to sort of standardize something. And the larger vehicles tend to have those more powerful chargers, that 80 amp, pickup trucks usually have those. Whereas the smaller vehicles tend to only have a 40 amp charger or maybe even smaller. So unless the vehicle manufacturers themselves decide to increase that, I really don't see that going up for consumer level light duty vehicles anytime soon. But we are seeing those DC fast chargers not only get significantly more powerful, but at the lower end, they don't have to be, that 350,000 watt number. They start about 25, just a little above that level 2 number. And so at some point, we're starting to see the prices of that drop to where you could put in a much faster charger than a level 2, but it's not going to be necessarily nearly as expensive as some of those top of the line ones. So that's what I would be looking out for over the next 5 years or so, is seeing those lower end DC fast chargers come down in price and complexity.
So I'm going to add to that. So since we're on a workplace charging call, again, a level 2 charger at 7.2 kW, 40 amps can give an EV driver about 25 miles of range in an hour. That should be plenty sufficient for an employee workplace application. The larger the level 2 charger, going on up to 19.2, the more cost of the hardware. So you'd have to evaluate whether or not a faster level 2 charging station really is needed in a workplace application. Maybe if you're looking at your fleet vehicles, maybe then you might want to look at the top end level 2, the extra cost for that hardware could work into your return on your investment. But again, for workplace employees, I would advocate that 7.2 kW is sufficient.
Great. Sherry wants to know if there's any rebates for level 3, aka fast chargers.
So DC fast chargers, there are some rebates available for those in certain applications. So from Evergy, we do offer an incentive of $20,000 per station, up to 2 DC fast chargers per site for a fleet installation or a public or highway corridor installation. There are no DC fast charger incentives for workplace.
I will add on to that, and that is that there are federal grants available for DC fast chargers if you are willing to open up your charger to the public. So, and it's not guaranteed money. This isn't, talk to Wendy, follow the requirements, and you're guaranteed to get a certain amount of money. They're competitive grant applications. You usually have to be partnered with a government entity of some kind. But if that's something you're interested in, they can cover up to 80% of the cost of an installation. So I'm thinking more of like if you're a grocery store or a shopping center and you've seen some of these Tesla superchargers, for example, at Targets and Walmarts. Those are the types of things that they have in mind when these grants are being doled out. So yeah, significant money available for those. Much more involved process, but I'd certainly be happy to talk to anybody if you're interested in that.
Well, great. Those are great questions. I really appreciate it. I know we want to get people out within the hour, so we have about 4 minutes left. So here are our links for people if you want more information, whether it's from us at Plug-in KC, Phil's group at WSP, or obviously Evergy and all the great things that they do. We will have the replay of this. Not only will be sent to you guys, but also will be up on our YouTube page. We also have the first webinar that was all about residential. So if you didn't catch that, you have questions about residential. I know we briefly touched on that. That was not the main focus of this, but it's something that you can look at any time. And again, thank you all for your time, and we really appreciate it. As always, reach out if you have any more questions, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.